Freek. All right. CSS superstar. What? CSS in 22. So let's start off. So feedback. The audio guys working on it. Let's start off with my title. So the official title, Freek, is Chrome Developer Relations Engineer at Google. And I'm concerned with CSS and DevTools. So if you have any question about CSS or DevTools today, feel free to ask. I also run a blog. It's bram.us. It's also on Twitter. The RSS feed is synced to there. Now, I think it's a really exciting time to be a CSS developer because there's a bunch of stuff that came to us. It's also a pretty confusing time to be a CSS developer because there's a bunch of stuff getting shipped to us. There's pre-releases coming every 4 weeks nowadays, pre-releases of browsers. They all have release notes saying, hey, we have this new feature and this new feature behind the feature flag. Oh, and you can try this and we fixed this bug and whatnot. And then you're like, oh, great, cool, new feature. But then you have to check the compatibility data sites to like, okay, but is this feature actually supported by all browsers or just this one? So you're like a bit, oh, I can't follow here. And you can't even follow more if you want. Like if you want, you could also follow the bug trackers, because sometimes implementations do have bugs, unfortunately, yes. And then you can also follow the platform trackers to see what's coming next. And if you want, you can also follow the CSS working group. And by this time, we're like, whoa, there's like too much information to follow. If I want to follow it all myself, I would never sleep if you were to follow it yourself. Thankfully, there's some sites that aggregate it all for you. There's Web Platform News run by Shimi Vidas. And there's also a section on web.dev where my colleague Rachel Andrew, every month, she publishes a post that says, hey, this was new in the web platform. In this browser, these features got shipped. In the other browsers, these features got shipped as well. So this is not Chrome only, this is Firefox, Safari. All the browsers are being mentioned on the new to the web platform post. Now what's also cool is that for you as a front-end developer, there's some efforts been going on between browser vendors. It used to be called Compat 2021. The follow-up is Interop 2022, and Interop 2023 was also announced. And this is really cool because this is all browser vendors agreeing on, hey, you know what? We are going to focus on these features this year, and we hope to ship them by the end of the year. What's also really cool is that this is entirely test-driven. There's a bunch of tests. It's called the web platform tests. And they are created before it is even implemented in browsers. And then browsers can implement the stuff and get a score. So this here is a screenshot. The one on the lower right, this is a screenshot of the score of yesterday or 2 days ago. So it could be that today we see other numbers there. The goal is to have 100% by the end of the year. Of course, that won't be really possible, but yeah, end up in the high 90s. That's like the goal. These are the features we are focusing on this year. So cascade layers, color spaces, containment, and I will be talking about some of these features during this talk. Do note as well the icons that are used there. Those are the correct icons. These are the icons for the beta versions or the pre-release versions of every browser engine. So you have Chrome Dev. You have Firefox, it's Chrome Canary, I think, or it's Chrome Dev. It's one of both. You have Firefox Developer Edition, and then you have also the Safari Technology Preview, which these tests run against. That also means why, for example, viewport units, the second to last one, or the second to last one in the first thing, has 100% in Chrome, because this is only available in the preview version of Chrome, and not in the stable version just yet. And I think with these efforts, it's like pretty okay. Like you're starting to love it again because you get all the info there and you know these features will ship. I can focus on them. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at some of the recent editions that came to CSS. And those are worth mentioning. That are worth mentioning. For example, the first one is custom properties. Now, this is an old feature in CSS. But I do want to mention it explicitly here because this has changed how I write my CSS. On every slide, you will see all the browser logos, by the way, and the versions that support them. So if it's a green box, it means it's entirely supported. The version number is mentioned in there. If it's a yellowish, orangish kind of box, that means that it has support in a pre-release version with a feature flag that you need to turn on. And if it's a red box, it means it has no support yet, and it's not actively being developed. So the first one, custom properties. This is how you create custom properties or variables in CSS. You use the -- prefix, which might look a bit weird, but hey, that's how the parser works. Think of it like the $ in PHP, which means, oh, this is a variable. Well, here -- means this is something custom that you have built. Now, I think this is really cool because you can use these variables further down in your code. And they can be affected by certain things. For example, if you are into SCSS or SAS and you use variables there, you think like, why would I want to use these custom properties? Well, the cool thing is, you can change the value in a media query, for example. If you have the version in SAS, those variables, those values get precompiled into your CSS outputted file, so you can't change them on the fly, whereas here you can, using a media query, for example, or using a selector, because these custom properties, they work like regular CSS properties. They inherit down the tree and whatnot, so this is really cool. You can use them in calculations. For example, here I have a page count custom property, which is then used to calculate a bunch of other things. What other things? I'll take a good look at the width of the book here. I'm changing the value through DevTools, so I'm incrementing it. You can see that the book gets a little bit thicker as the value changes. Pretty neat, right? Doing this just on the fly. So you could change it on hover if you want or whatever. I think this is really nice. Here's another thing that you can do. For example, if you have the base color palette, the hue and the saturation, you define the two values. Then you can create a color palette from those two values. So you have the lighter one to a darker one. Why is that really cool? Again, well, if you change your base values, your entire color palette just changes on the fly. So this is cool for theming. Just change two values and everything else changes. Yay! You can have default values. This is something that's not known by many people, but you can have default values in there. So if BG is not defined, it will fall back to the default value. It also works nice with JavaScript. You can read it in JavaScript. You can also write values from your JavaScript. For example, here I have an event listener on an element. And if I move my mouse over it, I am tracking the X and the Y position of my mouse on that element. And then I can use those values to, for example, create a flashlight. Or do something 3D-ish. This is again just CSS in action, basing itself on the X and the Y value, and then everything else gets derived from that. The transformation, the line, and whatnot. So, yeah, this is great, right? On to the next thing. On to a space-separated color notation. This is like a really easy one, but I just want to mention it because a lot of people just still use the old syntax. The old syntax is with commas. You have RGB and RGBA with the commas to separate each value. Nowadays, you can just use the space version. Why am I mentioning this? Well, other color syntax functions, like the new ones that are common, only support the space-separated version. The slash there is used to separate the alpha from the values. And you can use values 0 to 1, but also use percentages in there, which is nice. Aspect ratios. Anybody ever wanted to make like an aspect ratio kind of box? Like, hey, I want this to be 16:9. That's tricky, or it used to be tricky. Like, this is the old way. You would give it a width of 100%. You would set the height to 0, but then you would use the padding trick to set the padding top. And this worked because the padding is always resolved against the width. So if you use 100% padding, it's resolved against the width, not the height. And this made the box be 16:9. The easier way is use the aspect ratio CSS property. This one is supported by all browsers. It has really, really great support. To note though, the aspect ratio value is like, I would want this to be, so it's a soft requirement. It won't always work. For example, if you have both a width and a height set, then the aspect ratio property will say, oh, but you already have a width and a height, so you do have an aspect ratio, so I'm not useful here, so I won't be applied. So do note it's a soft requirement, not a hard requirement. Logical properties and values. This is not widely known, but this is great. Old CSS snippet on the left, new CSS snippet on the right. Instead of width, you say inline size. Instead of height, you say block size, because these are relevant, these are linked to the axis they are on. So by default, the horizontal one is inline size, and the vertical one is the block direction. So then you have the block size, the size in the block direction. Instead of left and right, you use start and end. Padding right becomes padding inline end, because it's on the inline axis and then at the end side of it. So that's why you use it. Why, you might be thinking? Well, this is great because these logical properties and values are affected by the writing direction, by the writing mode and the direction of your website. The direction is the most easiest one to explain, left to right, right to left. So if you have left to right, then the start is the left side, but if you have right to left, then the start is the other side, is the right side. Which means that if you use the version here on the right, on the end I should say, the version on the right, your website will adapt itself automatically to one of these two properties. For example, this side here, top to bottom, left to right, I flip the direction to right to left. You can see it changed, and now I also changed the writing mode, and this website just works. So the padding, for example, the white space to the left of the titles is always the same. So here's on the left, on the right, or on the top or the bottom. The website adapts itself. This is crazy. If you ever want to make an international website, use these. There's a nice cheat sheet that you can use, and you can toggle on, and you can see like, hey, this was the old value, this was the new value. So this is like the map for you to map things out. One note with that though is that the shorthands, for example, margin, if you give it 4 values, these currently are always top, right, bottom, left, like a compass, top, right, bottom, left. It is being discussed within the CSS working group to have a switch somewhere which says like, hey, I also want this to follow the logical flow thing. Smooth scrolling, which is like if you click a link and the page like nicely goes to a subsection of it. Anyone ever tried to do this? What did you do? npm install, what did you do? npm install something? Don't do that. Use this line of CSS, one line. Great, right? You add this, and now it works. Magic. Scroll snapping, I mentioned this yesterday with the covers floating by. So this is the exact same code on the x-axis, and then we snap a line start here, not at the center. A logical value, yes. There's a lot of things that you can do with it, a lot of hacks that you can do with it. I won't go into detail here because my colleague Adam Argyle, he has a wonderful presentation on this. It's a 50-minute, I think, the presentation is 50 minutes, and it's action-packed, it's crazy. What's even more crazy is that the entire slide tag that he uses to demonstrate this all uses scroll snapping. So that's mind-blowing. All right, so these were the things that are readily available in all browsers nowadays that have been there for a long time. Let's take a look at some of the new and upcoming additions. So now instead of all green boxes, you will see an orange box here and there, maybe even a red box. So let's take a look. Focus visible. This is great because focus is broken. If I tap to it, you can see like the focus outline, but if I click it, the button, it also shows me the focus outline. Like, this is not really what you want. This is ugly, right? Like if I click it, I don't want the outline to be here for the rest of its life until I click somewhere else. This is kind of broken, the current state of focus. That's why we have focus visible. It says, well, this one allows you to set the focus styles, but only when it's needed. When is it needed? When you're tabbing into it, not when you're clicking the button. So this is an adjusted example. I'm tabbing it, tabbing onto the button, I see the outline, I click it, there's no outline. In the past, many developers used to do outline 0 on elements. No longer do that, use focus visible instead. This is the code, really easy, with style and then the color. Size container queries, these are great because container queries in general allow you to style descendants based on aspects of a parent query container. It's really important to note that you can style descendants, so only children of a parent element, which means you can make a parent a container, but you can't style the container itself. You can only style the children inside there based on several aspects of that container. And a size query allows you to style the children based on the size of that parent. So where you have media queries, so you can say like, hey, if my page is narrow, a bit wider, or very wide, I want to like adjust the layout or whatnot. Now you can do that at the component level. For example, here, this is a card, but this is the very same component. Then at the bottom, it's the same component again. And note here, the image is next to the text. Here, the image is twice as wide next to the text, and then here, the image sits below. The image sits above the text. And this is because they use size container queries. If space is available, it goes on the right. If space is available, is not available, it goes underneath. And also note, the page width doesn't change. So where like page media queries are like a rough X, which you can use to size certain components, size container queries are like a very fine scalpel that you can use for this. This is what the code looks like. So we have an animal card, which was like the card component, which has the image and the text. We use display grid on it to lay out the thing. The wrapper outside of it, we give it a container type of inline size to establish the query container. And then we can use the new add container rule with a certain condition to then apply some other changes to animal card again. So what the animal card will do is it will look up to one of its parents and say, hey, which one here is the container? When it finds one, so the first one it finds, the first parent that is a container, that one will be used to check the condition against, which is min width 30 rems. And also, at 70 rems, well, we apply something else. This is wonderful, right? Because now you can build standalone components that resize all by themselves. Great. Cascade layers. By the way, on the top right, I sometimes mention Interop 2022. So cascade layers, for example, is part of Interop 2022. And it actually was the first feature that landed as part of Interop 2022. So if you see a slide here with Interop 2022 on the top right, that will mean if there's an orange box on there somewhere, it should turn red by the end of the year. We still have 3 months, right? So that will work. Cascade layers. If you take a look at this snippet, we have a few competing CSS declarations, because all these selectors select the very same element. So the color declarations in there, they are fighting like, hey, I want to set the color. And the other one goes, no, I want to set the color. So which one wins? Well, that's where the cascade comes. The cascade is the algorithm that CSS uses to resolve competing declarations. And it does it step by step. So first it checks origin and importance and context, inline styles, specificity, and order of appearance. Now I've marked these two there on the bottom right in yellow, because if we're honest, we're mostly struggling with these. We're mostly fighting with it. For example here, this is from a reset. A UL with a certain class, we apply 0 margin, 0 padding, no list style. But then if I want to style my nav element using the nav selector, this won't work, because specificity of the first one is higher than the specificity of the second selector. So we are struggling with the specificity there. What we then mostly do is like, we bump up the specificity to make it sure that it has the same specificity or a higher specificity. And we do this by adding the UL selector in there. So now they have both the same specificity. Now it's the order of appearance that counts. And the ul.nav comes last, so that one will win right here. This was a pretty easy fix, but here's another example. This is from an actual carousel. An actual carousel component. Say I want to change a slider item. This doesn't work. So I need to bump up the specificity again. If we're really honest, we just do this, right? Tap an important on there, yeah, it works. Well, that's because we now have changed the origin and the importance, and which is the first step of the cascade, and that's why this one wins. But this again gives problems, because if you're part of a bigger team, then your other colleague who wants to override this rule, oh, well, yeah, they have to use the same selector and slap another important on there, and then make sure it's lower than your code. That doesn't work. So we're struggling with it. Now, what if we didn't need to worry about specificity or order of appearance? What if we had an extra step in the cascade that would say like, hey, you know what? All these rules there, they will win from all these rules over there, no matter what their specificity or order of appearance is. And that's where layers come into play. Layers is an extra step in the cascade that allow you to group your styles and then give them a certain order. So this is the description which I just mentioned to you. They allow you to slice up your styles, group them, and give them a certain priority. You do this using the add layer statement, use add layer block, I should say. You also have an add layer statement. And applied to our problem that we had, it looks like this is a solution. You just wrap them, each and every one, in a layer. And here the layer step has determined the winner, so we don't need to worry about specificity or order of appearance. Now you might wonder, whoa, what just happened there? You wrap two layers around it and it somehow worked. Well, that's because the spec says cascade layers are ordered by order of appearance and they are given a priority. So the order of appearance is here on the left. So you have a layer reset, then base, then components, and then utilities, which is the order of things. You start at the top and you go to the bottom. The priority is the opposite. So the layer that is declared first has a very low priority. The layer that's declared last has the highest priority. And that's why this here wins, because our components layer is declared later, so it has a higher priority, and that's why it wins. Now I can keep on talking about cascade layers. I can talk about layer name reuse, anonymous layers. You can predefine the layer order, which is also cool. So you can have like a little statement at the top of your style sheet saying like, this is the order, and then your devs will just do stuff, and the order will be like predetermined for them. There's many, many more things to say about this. I won't bother you with it today because I have a talk about this. It's also on YouTube. I gave it at CSS Day. It's 50 minutes of me rambling about the cascade, how to calculate specificity, what all things you can do with layers. So yeah, I really recommend you to check it out. Even it was only for the part about how to calculate CSS specificity, which is like a very difficult thing, which I found out while making the slides for that. For example, here's like a new way of writing your styles. You have the layer statement on top, by which you declare all your layers, so you predetermine the order. The first one has the lowest priority, the last one has the highest priority. Then you can import some external style sheet into those layers. Then you can have all your layers there yourself. Oh, and by the way, you don't need to use layers. Like, you don't need to, because unlayered styles, those styles that are not part of a layer, they will always win from any layered style. You can like slowly start evolving your website to use layers while still keeping your unlayered styles, which is just great. Color function, ooh, this one has a lot of red box. Yeah, it's only in Safari right now. The Chromium commits have started to land as of like a few days ago, so this is really great. Color functions. We soon will have a color mix function, where you can say, hey, you know what, take this as the base color, add some black to it, make it darker, black 10%, black 20%, white 50%, make it lighter, which is great. Note that I'm using a custom property there as well, again, wonderful, right? Another thing, relative colors. You can take a certain color, mount it into a certain color space. For example, here I have a hex-defined color, but I want to use it in HSL, which is hue, saturation, and lightness. And the first time we change the transparency, but then in the second one, we rotate the hue by 180 degrees. And in the third one, we change the saturation. So we can say like, hey, take this color, use it in HSL, keep the H, change the S value, keep the L. I think this is great. Color spaces, we're getting there. Commits are coming. Every color that we use on the web is sRGB, which is very limited. So this is a representation of all the available colors, which are here being displayed on an sRGB projector, so which is kind of weird, but think of this like this is all the color that a person can perceive. The triangle that you see in there, these are the colors that we can use on the web in sRGB, which is fairly limited. Thankfully, there's more color space coming. For example, display P3. Did you notice it? sRGB, display P3. This one is like, it's a wider triangle, it has a wider gamut. If I put them on top of each other, like we have several ones, like Rec 2020 is very popular, with videographers, whatnot. If you take a look at it, you can clearly see like, okay, sRGB is like a smaller triangle, and then P3 is a bigger triangle. Which means, for example, like hot pink, which is my favorite debugging color, there's a hotter hot pink out there in display P3. We can use it. Well, soon we can use it. How do you use it? Well, the CSS working group, we have decided to give you a generic color function. The first value is which color space you want to target. And then you have 3 values which then map to that certain color space. And also the alpha, you can add it in. If you want to know what's happening underneath, like when is sRGB used and when is something else used, every hex color, every named color, every RGB color and whatnot, this is all limited to sRGB. All the other ones are not sRGB, so there are more colors that you can use. Now you might be wondering, like, why would I want to tap into other colors? Well, because you can use more colors, but also they work differently when interpolating between values. Here, in every color space, we are interpolating from blue to white. Just look at HSL or HWB there at the bottom. It goes pink. Since when does blue to white become pink? That's because how they work. For example, also as well, sRGB, they like always go to this sort of gray thing in the middle. So that's why we have these other color spaces available. For gradients, for example, OKLab, that's the one that you want to use. OKLab has like the nicest gradient going from blue to a light blue to the white. I could also keep on talking about this one for hours, but unfortunately I'm not that exactly familiar by it because this person is very familiar with it. That's Chris Lilly, the inventor of SVG, by the way, but he's also very active about all the color stuff in CSS. So all the color stuff in CSS, if you look at the spec, the editor, Chris Lilly, he will be on there. His wife, Leah Veru, will also be on there. He has a wonderful talk about it, explaining it all. How does it work and why and whatnot. Definitely check that one out. Next one up, new viewport units, Interop 2022. Yeah, it's coming. Chrome 108, by the end of the year, it will ship, yes. New viewport units. If you take a look at browsers on mobile devices, we have this, like we have to have the navigation bar and then you have a tab bar at the bottom. And then you say, hey, no, I want to fill up the entire viewport. We have a unit for that, 100 VH. It looks like this. And you're like, dude, browsers? Or you're like, browsers, why doesn't this work? It's spec'd somewhere why this is the case. But thankfully, we have new features available. If we take a look at a certain browser again, we can distinguish 2 states. We can distinguish one where all like the dynamic UA toolbars are expanded on the left, and then one where all those like dynamic interface things are retracted. We call the one on the left the small viewport. We call the one on the right the large viewport. And we have units for those, SVH and LVH. If you want to make something that fills up the viewport at the start, use SVH. For the other one, use LVH. Also, we have a unit that interpolates in between it, DVH, dynamic viewport height. And this one will adapt itself depending on the state of the extra user interface element. Do note the value does not get synced immediately because your application runs at 120 hertz, 120 hertz or 60 hertz or whatever, like depending on your screen, you have a really great refresh rate. We don't want to flush it to the browser at every tick, because then we would introduce jank because we have to recalculate layout, which is difficult. So the value, it gets flushed, it's throttled, or sometimes it's also debound. For example, on iOS, if you give like a flick and the page scrolls, once it stops scrolling, only then the value for DVH gets an update. So there's like a small delay in there. Again, I could keep on talking for hours about this. I actually talked for an hour about it. For the HTTP 203 episode, with Jake Archibald, who was the host, and I talked about viewport units and viewports as well. Like if you want to know why viewport units, like why the 100 VH bleeds out of the thing, it's explained in this video. 43 minutes, but I assure you it's not just some QC chit-chat, it's actual deep dive into viewports and whatnot. The has selector. This is behind the feature flag in Firefox right now. I hope they unflag it soon, because then we have support in all browsers, of course, given that people update their browser. But this is great because this is the parent selector people have been asking about for 20 years. And I'm not joking when I say 20 years. The actual bug report at the Mozilla bug tracker that requested this feature is 20 years old. Because with this, you can select parent elements and more. For example, the first one selects an A element that has an image in there. You select the parent of the image. You select the A element there. You don't select the image, but you select the A element that has an image in there. But the second one, you select an A element whose direct child is an image. So you can use combinators in there. You can use the plus or whatever. You can use it in there. And the last one selects sections that don't have a heading in there. I think this is pretty nice, right? But it's more than a parent selector. It's much, much more. For example, in the first line here, we select a figure that has a fig caption, which is the parent of the fig caption. But in the second one, we select the image inside of the figure that has a fig caption. So we select the a child of the figure depending on another element that is in the figure. How cool is that? Here we can select the previous element. Here we select the H1 that is followed by a paragraph. So we take the paragraph and we select the H1 just before it. This is great. There's like a ton of options that you can do with this. For example, you can have form checking just in CSS, because the browser has built-in form checking. Like if you enter an email address and it's wrong, it will say like, oh, this is invalid. It's exposed through the invalid pseudo clause, which you can use. Like here in this demo, this is my name. I have a red cross there. Now I'm typing in my email address. I drew it, and then the green check appears there. There's nothing in there. Waiting, oops, I enter a wrong value, and this is just CSS changing a thing. You can change the colors. You can show messages if you want, like use a display block, display none, depending on what. I think this is great. Another thing is, for example, you can show certain stuff depending on the value of a dropdown. If a dropdown has the value of 1 selected, then every element that has data show when with the value of 1 on there as an attribute will be shown. For example, here, it's a bit smaller, but I choose a car band, an Audi, and then I get to choose the list of Audis on the right. If I choose Ford, then I can choose some Fords out there, which is pretty nice. Do note that I'm only visually hiding things. So when you submit this to your server in the PHP code on the receiving end, you will still receive all the values of the form, so everything will still be sent. But this is like a visual affordance that you can build there. I think this is nice. Subgrid. Subgrid is great. Like here, for example. If you look at the grid, you have an item in there, but then the sub-item is like also nicely aligned to the grid that's being used. If I put on the lines, you can see it. Like the sub-item sits there nice on the grid lines of the parent of the grid. Wow, this is cool. How do we do it? Well, we have the basic code there on the top, but what do we use for the sub-item? Grid column what? And grid row? I don't know. If you do nothing, if you don't set anything on the grid column, or if you use like the values, if you like to try to guess it, we end up not on the grid, which is weird. Well, it's not weird. It works. It works as expected because the item has no grid. So we need to make sure that like the grid, it flows down onto the item so that the sub-item can use it. And you do this using 2 extra values on the item itself, which says like, hey, you know what? My grid template column and my grid template rows, those are in subgrid mode, which means take my grid from my parent, put it on me, and I will now use it as well. But what do you use as the values then? Do you use the grid lines of the parent grid or something else? Well, you use new grid lines, so they get renumbered. So here on the top left, it starts with 1 and it goes to 10. For the subgrid part, it starts with 1 and then it goes to only 6, I think. Yeah, 6. So now we know, for the child, we need the grid column starts at 3 and the grid row starts at 1. So we have these values here, and this is the entire example. Accent color, which is also a nice one. These checkboxes and like form input elements are not styled with the default blue. That's because I have set a accent color on there. Just one line. Hot pink, my favorite testing color. Yes, I like it. Media query ranges, a new way to write ranges. The old way is max width and then 750 pixels. The new way is to use just mathematical operators in there, which is nice. The weird part though is a bit like when you use between values. And it's like, oh, how do I read this 300 pixels as n equals width? If you read it as the width sits between 300 and 750 pixels, then it kind of makes sense. Two more things I want to talk about. Dialog and backdrop. Dialog is great. If you want to show something, you can show something in a dialog that sits on top of everything. This is an element, there's an element for it. So we have a button and we have a dialog element that you can use. And then using JavaScript, you can make sure that the dialog is shown. This is the JavaScript for it. When you press the delete button, show the dialog in a modal state. When you press any of the other buttons, close the dialog. Why is this? Well, this is like a more style example. Like confirm thing, it's animated and whatnot. Yeah, whoa, which is great. Why do you want to use this? Well, there's something in the browser which is called the top layer. And you can see it displayed here in DevTools. There on the right, it's displayed there. Every dialog sits in a top layer. So no matter how many z-index values that you have, the top layer will always be rendered on top, which is great. So that's why you want to use that's why you want to use dialog, because the dialogs always render inside of the top layer. And then the last one, individual transform properties that I want to talk about. If you want to transform an element, this is the x-axis is the time value. If you want to like change the scale and the rotation and translate it as well, notice the horizontal dashed lines. Like for example here, rotate, I don't have a value. Well, if I use transform, I have to add a value in there because otherwise it won't really work. So at every intersecting point, I have to calculate an extra value and then use it in my transform, which is a bit of a mess because we only want to try to do this. So why do, it's a bit confused. Thankfully, we have now individual transform properties available for translate, scale, and rotate, and you can use them individually. And then they will be combined at the moment thing gets animated. Here you have one combined set of keyframes. You can also split them up and then use every animation individually. One note with it, the order is fixed in which they are applied. So it's always first translate, then rotate, and then scale. So these two code snippets are equivalent. First translate, then rotate, then scale. And with that, I want to close off. I hope I have given you like an insight in what's new in CSS in 2022 and what's coming. I'm Bramus, I'm a Chrome Developer Relations Engineer at Google, and if you have any question about CSS, feel free to ask it. Thanks.